So a couple of things sparked this video. First, learning about Alan Moore's Lost Girls, and also this tweet. So Pop Culture Detective already made a really good video called Born Sexy yesterday, which is about the trope of women embodying childlike traits in order for them to appease the male ego and also for them to run around shamelessly naked. But today I want to kind of talk about the opposite of that trope, which is little girls embodying adult traits in order to make their pairing with their adult male co-star less creepy. So some movies that embody this trope, which I'm going to call the pseudo-maturity of traumatized girls in film. The films I want to talk about are Jodie Foster in Taxi Driver from 1976, playing a child prostitute named Iris. Then there's Natalie Portman, who's 12 years old in Leon the Professional, which came out in 1994. Then there's Alan Moore's Lost Girls, where Dorothy, Wendy, and Alice are all underage at some point in the book. Then there's Dominique Swain, who was 17 in Lolita in 1997. And then there's Mina Suvari, who was 20 in American Beauty, which came out in 1999, alongside a 40-year-old Kevin Spacey. Because most of these girls that I've listed above have experienced the horrors of adulthood and have had their innocence taken away from them, it's easier to portray them having adult-like qualities and helps the audience understand why an older man would take an interest in a 12-year-old girl. However, it's important to understand that these girls are still kids. Just because they've experienced trauma doesn't mean that they really understand reality or what it's like being an adult. It's not like Jodie Foster's filing taxes and Natalie Portman's enrolling in night classes. In fact, in Taxi Driver, Robert De Niro's character of Travis and Jodie Foster's character of Iris trauma bond over their shared experiences. He helps her get out of being a child prostitute while she helps him feel human again. The most famous scene that Jodie and De Niro have together is when they're sitting in a diner and Iris says that she ran away from home because she hates her parents and they hate her. Maybe she's experienced trauma back home that she's trying to run away from, but she plays it cool. This could just be a coping mechanism. If she didn't go back home in the end and her father didn't contact Travis saying that everything's okay and that she's back in school. Clearly she has nothing to run from and is just irresponsibly getting herself in trouble. In the scene, she talks fast and self-assured, showing that she isn't actually scarred by being forced to sell herself, but rather empowered.
Didn't you ever hear of women's lib?
Of course, this is all an act and she doesn't actually feel this way. In fact, in the shootout scene at the end, she's terrified and becomes a kid again. Though Travis saves her, he still forces her to watch 2 murders. The worst part to me about the movie is that it shows child prostitution as not being that bad. Iris's aesthetic is cool and quirky, and she's just seen as a working girl. This is extremely detrimental because child prostitution is not a choice. It's a hellhole mostly perpetuated by the elite, not just by some faceless scum. At the end of the movie, Iris is able to return to her normal life, but that's highly unrealistic for someone who's experienced the trauma that she has. Next, we have Leon the Professional, where Natalie Portman plays Matilda, a 12-year-old daughter of abusive parents, alongside co-star Jean Reno, the neighborhood hitman. Matilda goes to a school for troubled girls, and she's basically the quintessential, not like other girls girl. She wears quirky clothing, she smokes, and ditches school. One day, a crazed drug addict comes to kill her entire family, and she goes to Leon for comfort, and he takes her in, albeit reluctantly. After Matilda realizes that he's a hitman, he teaches her how to use guns, and she, in turn, repays him by cleaning his house. She tells him that she loves him. She tries on dresses and adult clothes for him to seem more grown up and earn his affections, which he does reciprocate but never verbalizes until the end of the movie, when they're being chased down by the cops. By the end of the movie, Leon dies and Matilda goes back to school and will always have fond memories of Leon. This movie highly romanticizes child and older man relations and even sounds like a romantic movie. There's romantic mashups of the two on YouTube, staring longingly at one another, and it's just creepy. Matilda falls into the pseudo-maturity trope because of her trauma, but it's important to remember that she's still a kid at heart and shouldn't be sexualized in any way, shape, or form. So for the next example, we have Alan Moore's Lost Girls, which I already went into excruciating detail in another video, so I'm going to try to keep it short here. For some reason, people love defending this book because they see it as an exploration of women's sexuality, and I would agree with that if it didn't detail the exploits of children. The story deals with three beloved childhood figures, Dorothy, Wendy, and Alice, and just goes to town on them. They're brutalized, they're raped, they're pimped out, they're in incestuous relationships, they're addicted to drugs, and then force other girls into submission in order to reenact their own trauma. Alice, who becomes addicted to opium, watches other girls be raped like she was. This is an example of an abuse victim who, to cope with their trauma, is complicit in the abuse of others. When Alice sees Lily, another girl being abused at Redmond's brothel, being systematically raped, in issue 3, she doesn't do anything and instead says, "I didn't hinder Lily's corruption." Clearly, Alice and probably Jodie Foster's character Iris will continue the vicious cycle of victim and predator. Alice rapes Wendy when they're adults in issue 2, chapter 12 about the 7 deadly sins. Wendy is at first reluctant and says no, but eventually gives in to Alice's advances after Alice wears her down. The book would have been fine if it just showed consensual acts between adults, and I even agree at the end that the women do help each other cope with their trauma. However, why must women be brutalized and traumatized in order for them to grow and to become strong? In the article, Childhood Emotional Abuse Predicts Late Adolescent Sexual Aggression, Perpetration, and Victimization by Eileen L. Zurbriggen, Robyn L. Gobin, and Jennifer J. Freyd, they stress that emotional abuse as well as physical abuse will lead adolescents to become more sexually aggressive as they age. As with the cycle of violence in which childhood victimization can lead to adult perpetration, disassociation is one of the likely medical pathways between childhood victimization and adult victimization. And it's clear that Alice disassociates. The first with her father's friend when he rapes her and starts to enjoy it by imagining that she's having sex with herself, and when she victimizes Lily, and later Wendy. The Lost Girls are clearly troubled individuals, and though the book doesn't shy away from that, it does do all of this for the pleasure of men. The next two don't really fit into the pseudo-mature traumatized girl trope because their trauma is either unspoken or the film is through the perpetrator's perspective, and thus it's harder to judge if the female characters are being sexual or are just perceived as being sexual because of the creepy older predator. First, there's Lolita from 1997, which stars a 17-year-old Dominic Swain alongside a 49-year-old Jeremy Irons. And I myself am guilty of loving this movie as a kid because I thought their romance was illicit and edgy. But as an adult, I don't see it that way at all. It's totally gross and very sympathetic to Humbert Humbert's character. Yes, he has abusive outbursts and violent moments, but they're always resolved because Dolores uses sex to get what she wants. Again, proving the thesis that children of sexual assault will become more sexually aggressive as they get older. However, she doesn't have a history of sexual abuse before she meets him, but the camera does make it seem as though she's constantly being sexual. First, there's a time where Humbert meets her and she's lying on the grass totally drenched. Then there's a time where she sits on his lap a little too closely, or when she says goodbye to him before she goes to summer camp a little too aggressively. It seems to us, because the film is told from HH's perspective, that she's constantly egging him on. However, I think that's giving the film way too much credit. These moments are framed as romantic in order to get us, the audience, on board with their future escapades. Thankfully, in the end, Dolores is able to run away from him into the arms of a much bigger creep, Quilty, who has a child pornography business. So HH's abduction of a child is okay, but what Quilty is doing is way too far. I don't really think that HH is in the position to judge. Anyway, Dolores is able to escape Quilty and Humbert, and by the end of the movie seems to be living a lower middle class life with her new husband. What she needs isn't a happy ending. What she needs is counseling and proper therapy. I guess because she's pregnant at the end, it shows that she's still a fully functioning human being. But then she dies in childbirth. What a thankless existence. And now, finally, we have my favorite movie as a teenager, and the film that got me into critiquing film in the first place, American Beauty from 1999. Starring a 40-year-old Kevin Spacey as Lester Burnham and a 20-year-old Mina Suvari as Angela Hayes. I wasn't sure if this one was going to make the list because, again, it's from Lester's perspective, and Angela didn't have any explicit trauma in her past. However, she is extremely sexually aggressive, and that makes me think that she did have some sexual trauma in the past.
Serious. He just pulled down his pants and yanked it out. You know, like, say hello to Mr. Happy.
Gross.
It wasn't gross. It was kind of cool.
So, did you do it with him?
Of course I did. He's a really well-known photographer. He shoots for L on like a regular basis.
Angela's character constantly talks about sex. She comments on Lester and his wife's sexual relationship to his daughter Jane. She talks about what boys are really thinking. She talks about masturbation. And then she even touts the fact that boys started drooling over her when she was only 12 years old. Clearly, she has some serious issues going on caused by something. However, when it's revealed at the end that it was all a facade and that she's actually a virgin, this stops her from getting raped by Lester. And in the end, her purity saves her. This could even turn the pseudo-mature traumatized girl on its head by saying that kids are just kids. They're not as mature as we say they are, and we should stop the culture that perpetuates this idea in the first place. Though this is a positive takeaway from the film, the other parts where she's being sexualized kind of takes away from this idea if you're not watching it with a close enough eye. Okay, so for part 2, I want to talk about the men and the boys and where they fit into this trope. Well, firstly, male characters are never really put into seemingly romantic or sexual relationships with older women that are to be taken seriously. Milk Money from 1994 is an obvious joke, and in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, Padme consistently turns Anakin down because of their age difference. Lastly, in The Graduate, Ben having sex with an older woman is seen as cool. However, there are some movies that deal with male trauma and pseudo-mature children, but not together. There's Mystic River from 2003, which deals heavily with the aftermath of sexual abuse. 3 kids are playing on the street in Boston when a fake cop and a fake priest come up and have tried to abduct the kids, and are successful in abducting one, and that's Dave. And when Dave grows up, he continually deals with this trauma. He's quiet and reserved, and it's even framed as kind of sexually perverse. However, this is just kind of there to throw us off the real mystery. After one of the boys from the beginning, Jimmy, discovers that his daughter was murdered, all fingers point to Dave. Jimmy then hunts Dave down and makes him give a false confession saying that he killed his daughter. However, before Jimmy pulls the trigger, Dave tells him what he was really doing, which was beating up a pedophile. Jimmy doesn't believe him and in the end, kills him. Mystic River is a great movie about how we vilify victims in society. Though victims of repeated abuse are more likely to be violent, that doesn't mean that we should vilify them or blame them for that abuse, but rather help them seek proper treatment. Lastly, there's Birth from 2004 starring Nicole Kidman and an 11-year-old Cameron Bright as Anna and young Sean respectively. So after Anna's husband Sean dies, she becomes convinced that this 11-year-old boy Sean is her husband reincarnated. Young Sean recounts the details of his and Anna's sex life as an 11-year-old. Anna then asks him for a kiss on the lips, watches him bathe and undress, and even asks him to marry her after he becomes legal. However, by the end of the movie, it's revealed that young Sean isn't older Sean reincarnated, and Anna goes on to marry her fiance that she's been with for 10 years. So this film does have aspects of the pseudo-mature girl trope, like being a child paired with an adult co-star. However, Sean doesn't really have any trauma history, and in order to seem older, he just has this delusion that he's Anna's reincarnated husband. In 2017, the Georgetown Center of Poverty and Inequality proposed a study entitled Girlhood Disrupted, The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood by Rebecca Epstein, Jamila J. Blake, and Talia Gonzalez. They argue that the perceived adulthood of black girls is because black people are less protected under the law and by law enforcement. Young black girls growing up under police brutality take on more responsibilities and grow up faster, already knowing the harshness that the world has to offer. They also theorize, because of the long history of slavery and slave stereotypes like the Sapphire, Jezebel, and Mammy, police officers as well as your average white citizen believe black girls are more stubborn, more sexual, and more mothering. Therefore, their childhood has been erased because they're already seen as mini adults rather than the children that they are. In their study, in which they surveyed 325 adults from various racial and ethnic backgrounds and different educational levels across the United States, most of whom were white, the results were very telling. In essence, adults appeared to place distinct views and expectations on black girls that characterize them as developmentally older than their white peers, especially in mid-childhood and early adolescence. The trope of pseudo-maturity of traumatized girls in film is even more damaging for black girls because too many movies focus on how adult black girls are. Black girlhood is therefore erased and replaced with white, fragile girls because they fit that ideal of femininity that needs to be protected. Black girls don't get that privilege. Their sexuality is never under siege. In movies where black adolescence is portrayed, for example in Precious from 2009, where the title character, who's supposed to be 16, is played by a 26-year-old Gabori Sidibe, she's shown being abused because they aged her up. Whereas Matilda from Leon the Professional is seen with bruises on her face and a bloody nose and is kind of beat up by her sister, it's never to the degree that Precious faces. A, because she's 12, but B, because even though she's a pseudo-adult like Precious, she's not as adult as her because she's white. And yeah, I think it's a good idea that they used an older actor in Precious because it's a very demanding role, but at the same time they still kind of erased black girlhood by not using a younger actress. And the abuse that's shown in Precious kind of reminds me of blaxploitation films. The director, Lee Daniels, even admits to being a little embarrassed to show this film at Cannes because he didn't want to make black people look bad. And that's the tough thing about being a minority filmmaker. You're supposed to represent everyone from your racial group when that's impossible. No white director is tasked with trying to represent all white people on film. Lastly, in a more recent film, The Hate You Give, starring Amandla Stenberg, playing a 17-year-old but who was actually 20 when the film premiered, shows black girlhood in a somewhat less traumatizing light. Star Carter, though well aware of the injustices in her society, is also just a kid. She goes to prom, hangs out with her friends and family, but is also forced into growing up and being a voice for her people after her best friend gets shot by the police. I'm not here to say that these movies shouldn't exist, because they do show you some of the realities of what it's like having your childhood ripped away from you because of your race. However, I do think we need to get out of this mindset that this black film will show you everything about black girlhood, because it's so much more complicated than that. It seems like for both white girls and black girls, we need to bring girlhood back into the picture. We need to let kids be kids, but especially for black girls who, because of systematic racism, get even less of a childhood than their white peers. Alright guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video. This was the topic that was on my mind for a really long time, and if you have any other examples of this trope in movies or TV shows or books, please leave it down below. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.